Hello, and welcome to GERO3127, Applied Research in Gerontology. For those of you who have taken GERO3126, which is Applied Research in Gerontology, Research Literacy, um, there are several things that you learned in research literacy: how to evaluate research, how to read a paper, how to make sense of the credibility of the authors, and so on. In 3127, what we will learn how to do is how to conduct research. I hope you've all taken the time to look at the course outline and look at how the course is laid out. If you noticed, there are several different modules, and each of these modules has a little bit of description of the chapter associated with the module. But what you will also see in each of these modules is a classroom lecture. Now, this is not simply a lecture that was recorded in class that we're making available to you, but this lecture has been specifically created to accompany the study guide and the module to support your learning. Keep in mind that the lecture itself does not cover the entire content of the chapter, and you are required to read the chapter in order to get the most out of the course. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about knowledge. So if you think about what knowledge is, it is truly the description of the state of something as to how something is, or the operation of some aspect of the universe upon which we can all act. An example to that effect is, if we know the state of the weather, if we know that it's going to be a sunny day, we know that we must use sunscreen and a hat, perhaps goggles, or whatever it is um, that would help us uh, be shaded or protected from the sun. It's also the description of operation. If we know that when you put a key into the ignition in a car and you turn it, the car turns on, we know that this is how it's supposed to work, and that will enable us to drive the car. So the thing to keep in mind is knowledge is a description that we have in our minds. We don't actually have to describe it out each time, but it's a description that we have in our minds that lets us act. If we do not have knowledge about something, it makes it very difficult to act, or we would be acting with great anxiety because we do not know what the outcome is of our action. Knowledge is also a social product. What that means is any knowledge we have today, think about different things that you know. Um, let's talk about the weather again. If you know that it's snowy, you will dress accordingly with a jacket, with gloves, and so on. The question is, how do you know that it's going to be cold or snowy? And when you think about it, when you use the Weather Channel app, it's an application which uses meteorological services to provide that information to you. And those services are created in the public domain for public interest several times by public agencies that get this information out. So knowledge is a product of social processes, which means social processes create everything that we know, other than knowledge that we gain simply through experience. And of course, because it's a product of society, it's owned by society as well. Your textbook then gets into the concept of authority. There are several people who tell us what we need to know on the basis of authority. Oftentimes, authority is based on position. When you think about what that means, is it is the authority that somebody has because over you or me because of the relationship that they are in. So, as a younger person, an authority person would probably be parents. The teachers could also be authorities. And you might have other uh, people that you associate with on a daily basis who end up being authorities for you. This is an authority based position. These people occupy a relationship, and a power dynamic exists between you and them. So when you go up to them to learn about something and they give you an answer, they are considered an authority, so you gain that information from them. The challenge, obviously, is an authority based on position is not authority based on expertise, which means going up to a person that you love and respect very much to ask them a question in an area that they're not skilled is not likely to give you the knowledge that you need to act appropriately. The opposite, of course, of authority based on position is authority based on knowledge. And what happens here is authority based on knowledge is experts in the area. So, for example, if you have an illness, the authority that can assist you with that illness would be a physician specializing in that area. So there are several authorities based on experts. If you had a music-based question, a professional musician or your music professor would be the best person to answer your question. If you had a question in gerontology, a gerontology professor would help you out. And these are authorities who are authorities on the basis of knowledge itself. Okay, so one has to distinguish as to who the question is being asked of in order to help their knowledge to move forward and to make decisions. Chapter 1, which this lecture is based on, then introduces the idea of the research process, because the research process allows us to evaluate the opinion of authorities. Your question might be, well, if I have a question about a certain illness, if there's an authority, can I not just ask them and get a solution? That might be true. However, you have to consider the fact that there might be multiple authorities giving you different answers about the same problem. Let's consider an example in nutrition. Let's say an individual is trying to lose weight by following a dietary pattern. What if one nutritionist tells them, well, you need to reduce carbohydrate? What if a second expert tells them, eat fewer calories? And what if their family physician says, well, you need to get a lot of exercise? What is one to do? And this is where research comes in. Research is important because it lets you evaluate the opinions of different authorities. So you can look at all three opinions and the evidence that's behind all of these opinions in order to make a decision to support what you might choose as knowledge to move forward on or to act upon. The research process also allows people to settle disputes about the nature and operation of some aspect of the universe. So oftentimes what we know and how we know it is contextually based. Where do we come from? What have our parents told us? What have our communities told us? And there could be a colleague, a peer, who comes from a different background with a different set of ideas of what they seem to consider knowledge. The research process allows both of you to engage in a transparent manner to identify what indeed is more supported by evidence and facts and what might not be the best option. So, as I mentioned, what makes research so powerful is there is a central set of rules and principles which are very transparent, very clear, and consistent. So two researchers, if they go through the same set of steps and collect very similar data, it is unlikely that they will come to very different conclusions. So it's guided by these rules and principles. which allows someone researching to make very confident statements about knowledge of the world based on our own observations. And then the question is, well, if we are undergraduate students in gerontology or an associated field, and we have no intention of doing research, why do we need to do research? To that, I would answer that everybody uses research professionally. It's not just, professors in universities. Corporations do research all the time about their products, about their marketing strategies, about their advertising. Social workers participate and conduct research to find out how they can best assist the communities that they're serving. Different professionals in different fields do research all the time. And government agencies, of course, they collect a lot of data. Think about Statistics Canada and how much information they collect during census and other surveys that they do. So research is done not just by scientists and researchers, but a broad swath of people. If you are professionally acquainted with any organization and you're in employment, you will participate and perhaps conduct research at multiple points in your life. Going back to the idea that knowledge is a smart product, what do you think about these different pieces of information that, it used to be widely believed that the earth is flat? For the longest time, until Copernicus discovered um, or postulated, because of his amazing telescopes, that the world was indeed not flat, but it was a sphere that revolved around the sun. Of course, he was not very popular for his thoughts and expressions, and I believe he was imprisoned. I'm not entirely sure about that. You have to realize that people truly believed the earth is flat, and that was common knowledge, and people believed if you sailed far enough, you'd fall off the edge of the earth. For the longest time, people used to believe that mental health and mental illness are caused by evil spirits. As recently as the 19th century in the United States, women were burnt at the stake, branded as witches. This still happens in different parts of the world where people in remote rural communities are labeled as practitioners of occult forms and persecuted. So, when you think about all of these different pieces of information that were passing for knowledge, you have to ask yourself, was this belief common? And even if you don't know, I'm going to tell you that it was common belief. Who was the authority? Who was the authority figure who was proposing this information? Typically, it was someone who was high in social status. So it might have been a religious figure, or a political authority, or sometimes a combination of both. The question is, how is it different from what we know today? And you can probably say right away that none of this is true as we know it now. The question is, how did we figure it out? As you're thinking about that, since we know different things through different ways, what's the reality about traditional knowledge? Does that hinder human inquiry? Suppose we know something through our cultural or religious practices. Does that impact our ability to ask deeper questions, analyze rationally? What about indigenous knowledge? We have um, people, Aboriginal people in different parts of the world who come up with different faith systems and know the world differently than we do. What about their knowledge? How does that fit in to what we know as a social product. Whether it's accurate or not, we don't know, but how does everything fit in? And these are not questions that I'm asking you to provide an answer, but these are just things to think about. So let's do a little exercise. It may be repeated again in your reflective activities section on the module itself, but let's discuss this anyway. Let's think about this. As we know, gravity exists. Newton proved that when he saw an apple fall. Right? So celestial objects such as the Earth, the planets, the Sun, and the Moon all have the power of gravity. A full moon results in weird behavior, and that's how the term lunatics came about, right? So this is I'm putting out this information. I'm not saying this is true or this is not true. I want you to think about this. So I'm going to postulate that a full moon results in weird behavior. Professionals who work in regional care facilities, including hospitals and prisons, long-term care facilities, they claim that residents become increasingly agitated during a full moon. If you want to ask, well, I've heard this and I believe this, you wouldn't be alone. Lots of professionals, nurses, doctors, social workers, personal care workers, police officers, wardens, they all swear by this. The question is this supported by scientific fact? And a study done as far back as 1978 demonstrated that most of the scientific literature on the so-called lunar effect dispels this myth. And it's actually not proven in fact. It's a perception. When we look at articles like this, the 7 new retirement strategies that we see here, how do we know these strategies are any good for older adults? If you've done the research literacy course, you probably know to question the source. Where is the source? Where is this magazine coming from? Where is this article coming from? And when you check this out, this is the Globe and Mail, and then of course you can question the credibility of the author. This is from 2012, and it's relatively recent. It's 2020. It's 8 years old. Perhaps not that recent. Perhaps you can look at a more recent article and ask these questions. Well, is this a reliable source? Is it a good quality article? Does that make sense? So as we look at knowledge, we have to, or information that will become knowledge if we can use it, we have to keep asking questions about where does this information come from. Again, this is an article in the Globe and Mail. They're talking about annuities, which is an investment product. These are just examples. You don't have to learn what an annuity is. But again, key things to look at is what is the source? Who is the author? Does this make sense? Do you think it's reliable? The kind of questions you really want to ask is who sponsored the study? Who brought about the study? Who conducted it? Well, who proposed that the study should occur? Who actually did the study? Who was being studied? So let's take the example of retirement strategies. If you look at one of the big retirement investment firms who sponsored the study, well, if you aren't suspicious, you should probably be suspicious, because it's likely that the strategies they propose are strategies that they are most closely aligned with. You have to be careful about who conducted it. Was it somebody that an investment firm dealing in retirement product hired students or researchers to conduct the study? Who is the population being studied? Well, was the retirement firm looking at people who are unsure of their financial status, or less financially literate, who are being examined as a potential target for selling their product. Well, the point here is we have to think deeply about things that we read as to where it comes from, who wrote it, and who is being studied. Because if we don't have this information, we don't know whether that piece of information which we might use for knowledge applies to us and is of use to us. So, the goal of scientific research is to do a few different things. It must produce an acceptable description and explanation of the nature of or operation of some aspect of the universe. Research must provide this description being transparent. It has to involve the attempt to gather the evidence or the proof in such a way that everyone can see why this evidence is gathered and how it is gathered and what the findings were. And as I mentioned before, this is what allows two different researchers who go through the same process with a similar way to gather the evidence, similar way to sort the evidence, and go through the results. They will end up with the exact same conclusions. It's this transparency that allows others to draw their own conclusions about what is the basis of findings. So the goal is obviously to provide this acceptable description using complete transparency to create knowledge and obviously to settle debates, because there are debates all the time as to what is the best solution for something. So research does this obviously by collecting transparent data and laying them out so that everyone can see what has occurred. So let's ask the question, what is a science? Most of you are gerontology students, and obviously you're thinking, well, I'm not in the sciences. Well, surprise, surprise. Gerontology is a science. Psychology is a science. Any discipline that collects and evaluates measurables. If you can measure something, if it's being collected and studied, you're in a science. Example, sociology, psychology, biology, geography, physics, etc., gerontology as well. If you can collect measurable data, you're involved in a science. Okay? So anyway, that pretty much concludes the lecture for now. What you should do is go through the rest of the module, go through the reflective activities that are there, participate in the discussion. The instructions for the discussions are present in the module, and you will no doubt learn a lot just from following through all of these different steps. With that, I will end this lecture and see you in lecture 2.